Story 1. The Apartment Above the Fog. I never thought moving to Portland would feel like stepping into a different world. The city had its charm. Foggy mornings along the Willamette River, streetcars rattling over old tracks, tiny coffee shops tucked between abandoned warehouses. But the apartment I rented quickly made me question everything. I'm a freelance photographer, 32, recently single, and looking for a fresh start after a rough breakup. My new apartment was on the 4th floor of an aging building in the Northwest District. It had character. Hardwood floors that creaked with every step, a narrow spiral staircase, and big windows that caught the gray morning light in just the right way. My neighbor, a young woman named Clara, lived below me. She was in her late 20s, a software engineer, quiet, polite, and always in earbuds. We exchanged hellos, but nothing more. It started innocuously enough. A few days after moving in, I noticed odd noises at night. The kind of noises that are just off enough to set your teeth on edge. Faint dragging sounds above the ceiling, almost like someone was moving furniture, though the apartment above mine was supposedly empty. At first, I chalked it up to the building settling, pipes groaning, or maybe my imagination. Then things began to shift. Small items in my apartment moved slightly. My coffee mug was never in the same spot. The stack of magazines I had neatly arranged on my coffee table one morning was staggered the next. A drawer in my kitchen, which I always kept locked with a tiny padlock, was slightly ajar, though I never touched it. One evening, I came home after a photo shoot around the Pearl District and noticed something on my kitchen counter. A thin, oily residue smeared across the surface. It smelled faintly of motor oil, industrial and sharp, and it wasn't there that morning. I wiped it clean, assuming I had knocked something over. But then I realized my phone charger was missing. My charger. A simple, useless object. But gone. The first time I saw him, I froze. I was taking out the trash down in the alley behind the building when I saw a shadow slip out of the entrance above mine. A man, tall and lanky, with a weathered leather jacket and a cap pulled low, disappeared before I could even blink. There was a small metal tool in his hand, gleaming in the dim light, and I had the sinking feeling he'd been inside my apartment. I called the building manager the next morning, a kind older woman named Mrs. Lang, who claimed she hadn't rented the unit above mine to anyone. "It's been vacant for months," she said. "Maybe someone broke in." She shrugged and offered no further insight. Over the next few weeks, the disturbances escalated. I'd hear the unmistakable sound of someone walking barefoot across my ceiling late at night. My front door would sometimes be slightly unlatched, even though I double-checked every lock. I found objects I hadn't touched scattered across the apartment. My camera strap on the bathroom sink, my favorite notebook opened on a random page, a pair of socks in the fridge. The oily substance appeared again on my shoes, on the edge of my bed, on the inside of my jacket pocket. I began documenting everything meticulously. Photos, timestamps, notes. At first, I thought it might be Clara, though she seemed far too timid for such behavior. But when I asked her politely if she had seen anything unusual, she looked at me blankly and shook her head. She seemed genuinely frightened by my questions, as though even discussing it was dangerous. One night, I decided to stay up and catch whoever, or whatever, it was. I set up my camera to record the living room and kitchen, dimly illuminated by a single lamp. Around 2 a.m., the creaking started. Slow, deliberate pacing across my ceiling. Then, a soft tap at the kitchen counter. I held my breath, gripping the camera remote. The camera's motion sensor captured a figure, a man, face obscured by shadow, reaching for the cabinet where I kept my lenses. His movements were calm, meticulous, almost surgical, and then, as suddenly as he appeared, he vanished. The video showed no exit route. The apartment above was empty. By this time, I was terrified but also obsessed. I began investigating the neighborhood. I spoke to longtime residents and learned that several had noticed strange occurrences around this building over the past year. Objects disappearing, doors unlocked, lights flickering. One elderly man recalled seeing a man in a leather jacket, just like the one in my footage, loitering in the alley behind the building. The climax came on a foggy Tuesday morning. I woke to the sound of shuffling and whispers outside my apartment door. My heart pounded as I peered through the peephole. No one. I stepped into the hallway cautiously and saw faint blue streaks smeared across the floor, like someone had been dragging something with gloves. The smell of the oily residue filled the air. I grabbed my phone to call 911. As I dialed, I felt a presence behind me. Spinning around, I saw a tall, hooded figure standing at the end of the hallway. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could see his eyes glinting with an unsettling intelligence. Before I could react, he vanished, literally vanished, as if swallowed by the fog drifting through the stairwell. The police came, searched the building, and found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no footprints. I moved out the next day, leaving behind everything I couldn't carry in a rush. I've never returned. Even now, years later, I sometimes dream about that apartment. The soft creaks in the ceiling, the oily streaks, the shadow in the hallway. The fog never felt the same again. Story 2. The tenant upstairs who watched everything. I moved into my new apartment in Portland, Oregon during the late summer of 2023. It was a modest third-floor unit in a converted warehouse, complete with exposed brick walls and tall windows. My name is Lucas, 32, a freelance photographer who spends half his days traveling and the other half editing at home. I was excited to finally have a space of my own, away from roommates and chaotic Airbnb rentals. The building had a reputation for being quiet. Most tenants were professionals or students, and I thought it was perfect. The only oddity was the tenant above me, an older man named Mr. Holloway, who kept to himself, rarely leaving his unit. He was in his late 60s, slightly stooped, and always wore oversized sweaters, even in summer. I barely noticed him at first. Things started subtly. I'd come home after a long day of shooting and notice my furniture slightly shifted. My chair pushed a few inches away from the wall. A book moved from the shelf. At first, I chalked it up to fatigue or my own absent-mindedness. But then I began hearing small, deliberate creaks from the apartment above, even when I knew Mr. Holloway wasn't home. One evening, around 10 p.m., I was editing photos in the living room when I heard a soft knock on my front door. Nobody. Then a tiny metallic scrape, like the tip of a screwdriver against the door frame. My heart started racing. I locked the door and peeked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. Over the next week, the disturbances escalated. Objects appeared in places I'd never put them. A coffee mug would be on the floor, a stack of magazines on the kitchen counter rearranged. One night, I opened my bedroom door and found a thin layer of oil smeared across the windowsill, glinting under the streetlights outside. I had never seen anything like it. I decided to investigate quietly. I started paying attention to Mr. Holloway's patterns. His unit above me had a sliding balcony door. On the nights when the disturbances were worst, I noticed a faint light flickering through the blinds, sometimes a flashlight, sometimes just a reflection. I tried speaking to him casually in the hallway, but he was vague, evasive, always muttering about the building needing to be orderly. Then came the most unnerving incident. I returned home from a weekend photography trip to discover my trash had been rifled through. Among the scattered contents were photographs I had never seen him touch, old family pictures, a passport, even sketches I had made but never shared. I realized someone had been in my apartment. Panicking, I called the building manager, who reluctantly checked the security footage. It was grainy, but there it was, a shadow moving through my apartment while I was away, small enough to be overlooked, but deliberate in every motion. I confronted Mr. Holloway. He didn't deny it. Instead, he chuckled softly and said, "I'd just like to know who I'm living with." I moved my bed and electronics to block entrances, installed extra locks, and even began sleeping in my clothes, ready to flee. Yet the incidents continued. One night I woke to the sound of whispers. Not loud, but almost chanting, coming from the ceiling above. My laptop had been turned on. A single text document was open with one line repeated over and over. "I am here, always here." The breaking point came one late evening when I returned from a shoot. My apartment door was ajar. Inside, every window was slightly open, and the smell of antiseptic, like a clinic or chemical cleaner, filled the air. On the kitchen table was a small, homemade contraption, a rod wrapped in a blue cloth, tipped with some hardened adhesive. I didn't touch it. I backed out and called the police. The officers arrived, searched, and left. They found no fingerprints, no traces of forced entry. I begged them to install extra patrols, but the building was technically private, and Mr. Holloway was legally allowed to be in his apartment at all times. The final straw was when I returned from a brief trip to the coast. My neighbor from the second floor, a young woman named Maya, met me at the door, looking pale and anxious. She whispered that she had seen Mr. Holloway on my balcony, standing perfectly still, staring into my apartment for hours while she did laundry. That night, I heard footsteps pacing above me, slow and rhythmic as if counting time. I didn't sleep for nights. I began recording every sound, every creak. Every morning, I found minor disruptions. Keys misplaced, notebooks rearranged, my camera lens slightly unscrewed. There was no damage, no theft, only a creeping, unnerving presence that made my apartment feel invaded. Eventually, I had to move. I packed only essential belongings, leaving the rest behind. As I carried my bags down the street, I glanced up at the top floor. A faint silhouette was at a window, watching. Mr. Holloway's eyes met mine for a brief second, then disappeared. Years later, I still have nightmares. I dream of someone always above, always watching, their footsteps echoing even when I'm far away. I know I'll never have closure, but I've learned to trust nothing that seems ordinary. Sometimes the quietest neighbors are the ones who see everything. Story 3. The Man Behind the Foggy Windows. I had never intended to move to Portland, Oregon. It was a spontaneous decision, a whim to escape the monotony of my life in Denver and the endless hum of my office job. At 28, I felt like I was just existing, not living. When I found a small apartment in an old converted warehouse in the Pearl District, I didn't hesitate. The loft had exposed brick walls, towering ceilings, and large foggy windows that faced an overgrown courtyard. It was perfect, if you ignored the rumors about the building's previous tenants. My neighbor across the hall, a middle-aged man named Conrad, was the first person to make me uneasy. He was in his early 50s, with a meticulously trimmed beard and piercing gray eyes. He worked from home, supposedly as a freelance archivist, but he never seemed to leave his apartment. Occasionally, I'd see him in the courtyard, meticulously tending to small potted plants or rearranging the ancient patio furniture. He never spoke to anyone, but his presence was constant and somehow oppressive. At first, it was just the little things. I hear him whispering in the hallway when no one was around, or moving furniture late at night. Sometimes the sound of his footsteps, soft but deliberate, echoed through the metal stairwell. I chalked it up to paranoia, a side effect of moving into a dense urban space filled with strangers. Then the notes started appearing. At first, it was a single sheet of paper slipped under my door. Do not forget to water the plants. Failure will be noticed. Confused, I ignored it. The next day, there was another note. Windows open at night, invite trouble. Close them properly. I lived on the ground floor, and my apartment's windows faced the courtyard directly. Every time I glanced outside, I half expected to see him standing there, watching. One evening, I invited my friend Lisa over. She was a photographer, 26, with a keen eye for urban decay, and she often stayed for days, helping me decorate the loft. We were drinking tea and laughing about an upcoming gallery opening when a loud knock rattled my front door. I froze. My apartment had a peephole, but it was too foggy to make out anyone. Probably just a delivery, Lisa said casually, but her voice lacked conviction. The knocking continued, louder now, almost rhythmic, like a pulse. I cautiously peeked through the peephole and saw nothing but shadows. Then I noticed a small folded note stuck under the door. Trembling, I picked it up. Written in precise, almost calligraphic handwriting were the words, "We spoke yesterday. Remember our conversation?" Lisa and I exchanged glances. "We didn't speak to anyone," she said, her voice rising slightly. I called Conrad's apartment, but there was no answer. The knocking and whispering continued intermittently for the rest of the night. We stayed awake, listening, hearts pounding, every shadow in the foggy courtyard twisting into something sinister. The next morning, I found the courtyard gate slightly ajar. It was a heavy, iron gate that always stayed locked. I knew I hadn't left it open. When I asked the building manager, she shrugged, pretending not to know anything, but I wasn't convinced. I began checking my locks multiple times a day, and sometimes, when I returned from work, I noticed footprints on the dusted wooden floor of the courtyard that didn't belong to anyone living there. A week later, Lisa stayed over again. Around midnight, the whispers began, low and indistinct, like someone practicing a language just out of hearing range. I had left the window cracked for air, and a soft glow from the fog outside made the room eerie. Suddenly, a shadow moved outside the window. Lisa screamed. I grabbed a flashlight, but the courtyard was empty. Yet the shadow lingered in my peripheral vision, darting from the window to the gate and back again. I considered calling the police, but I wasn't sure what I could tell them. There were no signs of forced entry. No footprints, no fingerprints, only the notes and the pervasive feeling of being watched. Then the surveillance cameras arrived. Our building manager installed them after complaints from other tenants who had started murmuring about Conrad. The footage was chilling. Each night, Conrad could be seen moving with deliberate care, checking each door, peering through windows, and leaving notes under apartment doors. But what terrified me most wasn't the recordings, it was what they didn't show. On several nights, shadows passed in front of the cameras, figures too tall and thin to be human, or perhaps moving in unnatural ways. One evening, I decided to confront Conrad. I knocked on his door, my heart hammering. The door opened before I could knock a second time. He was calm, unnervingly so, and smiled faintly. "I wondered when you'd come to talk," he said, voice smooth, almost musical. What are you doing? Why all the notes? The whispers?" I demanded, voice cracking. He tilted his head, studying me as if I were an insect under a microscope. "I only ensure order," he said. "Some things need to be watched." The courtyard, The windows, the lives within, everything has its place. Everything. I backed away, confused and terrified. He didn't move, but I could feel his eyes on me as I stumbled down the hallway. That night, the whispering became louder, almost intelligible, chanting my name over and over. The notes continued. You saw me. Remember the order. After weeks of sleepless nights, Lisa convinced me to move. I packed my belongings and left Portland without telling Conrad or anyone else. The notes stopped. The whispers faded. But even now, years later, I sometimes see a shadow in foggy windows when I walk down the street, and I hear my name called in the faintest echo. Somewhere, Conrad is still watching, still ensuring the order, waiting for the next person foolish enough to live in the foggy apartment he calls his domain. Story 4. The apartment above the library. I had always wanted to live in Boston, away from my small hometown in Maine. After graduating college, I finally got a job at a local publishing house and rented a modest apartment near the Boston Public Library. The building was old, brick-walled, with narrow staircases and a creaky elevator that groaned every time it moved. It had a certain charm, but I was warned by the landlord that the tenants above me were unusual. I didn't think much of it at the time. My apartment was on the second floor, with a small balcony overlooking a quiet alley behind the library. The alley had an iron gate that led to a shared courtyard. I loved sitting out there with a cup of coffee in the morning, watching the sunlight filter through the old trees. I wasn't prepared for what would unfold. The tenants above me were a young couple, Miles and Clara. Miles was in his late 20s, a software engineer who worked remotely, and Clara, a freelance illustrator in her mid-20s, spent most of her days drawing and painting in their apartment. They were friendly at first, always waving when we crossed paths in the stairwell. But soon, I noticed small oddities, footsteps pacing late at night, muffled conversations in a language I didn't understand, and the faint sound of moving furniture above me in the dead of night. At first, I thought I was imagining things. One rainy evening, I stayed late at the office and returned around 11 p.m. The hallway was dimly lit, and I saw Miles at the top of the stairs, peering down as I approached. He smiled politely, but there was something in his eyes that made me step back instinctively. I told myself it was nothing. A few weeks later, I came home after a long day and found the gate to the courtyard slightly ajar. My apartment door had been locked as usual, so I assumed it was the wind or a neighbor. But when I went out to close it properly, I noticed faint footprints in the damp soil, small, precise, and leading straight toward my balcony stairs. I froze, heart hammering. The footprints stopped at the edge, as if someone had just vanished. The next day, I mentioned it to my coworker Emma, who had lived in the building before me. Her face went pale. She told me the couple above had a reputation for strange behavior, arguments that could be heard through the ceiling, midnight door slamming, and guests who came and went without anyone noticing. Some tenants had moved out because they felt unsafe. She shrugged it off lightly, but the unease in her voice lingered. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, I heard the distinct sound of the ceiling hatch opening, the small attic access they sometimes used for storage. The sound was deliberate, not random. Then came a soft knock on my balcony door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I peeked through the curtains. No one was there. But then a faint whisper floated through the air. "Are you awake?" I locked the door, but sleep was impossible that night. Every creak, every tap of the radiator seemed amplified. Around 3 a.m., I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the stairs outside my apartment, slow, deliberate, stopping at my door. Then silence. I waited, frozen, holding my phone under my pillow. When nothing happened for a long while, I tried to calm myself and eventually fell into a shallow sleep. The next morning, a package was on my doorstep. A small wooden box, unmarked, with no return address. Inside was a single Polaroid photo of my balcony, taken from above, showing me asleep at the window. I didn't know whether to call the police or the building management, but before I could decide, I noticed that Miles and Clara were gone. Their apartment was dark, the door locked from the inside, and no one had seen them leave. I tried to resume normal life, but the unease never left me. Then, over the next month, I started noticing more anomalies. My mail would sometimes be rearranged. Notes appeared under my door with cryptic messages. "We're watching. Don't look up. It's just a matter of time." I never replied, never confronted anyone. But the anxiety gnawed at me relentlessly. One night, I stayed in the library late, trying to immerse myself in work to distract from the tension at home. When I returned, the hallway lights were flickering and the elevator doors were slightly ajar. I walked cautiously toward my apartment. As I reached the balcony door, I saw faint shadows moving across the courtyard. I froze. The shadows weren't human. They stretched and twisted, defying the angles of the moonlight. I felt their presence, as if they were observing, waiting. I ran inside, locked every door, and called Emma. She insisted I contact the police, but when they arrived, they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of entry, no cameras capturing anyone near my apartment. They left advising me to remain vigilant. But something in their faces told me they believed there was more than just paranoia at play. Weeks later, I moved out. The couple never returned, their apartment empty for months. But sometimes, when I walk past the alley near the library, I feel eyes on me, a subtle weight pressing down on my shoulders. The memory of the Polaroid and those twisted shadows lingers, a reminder that some disturbances don't need reason, explanation, or closure. They exist simply to unsettle, to remind you that safety is sometimes just an illusion. Even now, I sleep with the blinds closed and triple-check every door. The haunting thought follows me. What if they're still watching, from somewhere above, waiting for the next chance to peer down at someone unsuspecting? Story 5. The Neighbor Who Watched the Night. I never thought moving to Ashford, Vermont would be a mistake. At 28, I left Boston behind for a quieter life, a small apartment above a local bookstore in the town's historic district. My new place was modest, a 2-bedroom loft on the second floor of a converted 1920s building, with high ceilings, exposed brick, and a fire escape that rattled in the wind. I loved it. Peaceful, quiet, until the new neighbors moved in. The first neighbor I noticed was an elderly man, Mr. Thorne. He was in his late 70s, thin, with piercing gray eyes that seemed to follow anyone passing his house. His lawn was perfect, impossibly green, trimmed like a golf course, though the neighborhood was just a cluster of old brick homes and cobblestone streets. He always sat in a wicker chair on his porch in the evenings, silently watching the street, even when no one walked by. At first, it was just curious, a little unnerving, but harmless. My life was simple. I spent my mornings at the bookstore, working with Clara, a sprightly woman in her mid-30s with a sharp sense of humor and a tendency to hum off-key while shelving books. Afternoons, I wrote freelance articles, occasionally meeting friends at a cafe a few blocks away. Evenings were quiet. I liked it that way. Then, the odd things began. It started with small noises in the hallway outside my apartment. Footsteps at midnight, soft scratching at the walls. I told myself it was the old building settling. But then I noticed my window, which overlooked the narrow alley behind the building, would sometimes be slightly ajar in the morning. I was certain I had closed it the night before. One evening, as I returned from the cafe, I saw a figure crouched by the fire escape outside my window. I froze. It was a young man, maybe 19 or 20, scruffy, wearing a hoodie too large for him. He had dark hair covering half his face and was staring up at my window. I didn't know what to do. I hurried inside and locked every door. The next day, I spoke to Clara. She looked concerned. "You know the Thorne family," she said. "Their grandson is unusual. Name's Alex. Lives with him mostly. Doesn't leave much. People say he's weird." I tried to shrug it off, thinking it couldn't be a coincidence. But over the next week, the noises escalated. Alex would be on the fire escape late at night, sometimes whispering. I couldn't make out the words, but his tone was insistent, almost pleading. One night, I saw him leave little notes taped to my window. Cryptic phrases like, "Don't sleep tonight," or "He sees you." I took them down immediately, heart pounding, but they would reappear the next night. I spoke to Mr. Thorne once. I politely asked him if Alex was bothering me. He looked at me for a long time, then smiled thinly. "Alex is harmless," he said. "Just curious. He doesn't mean to frighten anyone." But his eyes didn't smile. Then it got worse. One morning, I woke up to the sound of the fire escape rattling violently. I looked out my window and saw Alex at the bottom holding something metallic. I couldn't see clearly in the dim light, but it looked like a toolbox. He looked up at me, and for a moment, our eyes locked. A shiver ran down my spine. I backed away from the window, heart thudding, and called the police. They came quickly, but by the time they arrived, Alex was gone. Nothing was stolen, nothing broken. The officers gave a polite shrug and left, chalking it up to a prank or neighborhood kid. I tried to sleep that night, but I kept hearing whispers, soft knocks on the walls, footsteps pacing outside my door. I installed a small camera near the window. The next morning, I checked the footage. My stomach turned. Alex had climbed the fire escape in the middle of the night. He didn't enter my apartment, but he stood there for hours, whispering and staring directly at the camera, as if he knew I was watching. I told Clara, who suggested talking to Mr. Thorne again. Hesitant, I knocked on his door. He opened, looked me up and down, then said, "Curiosity is a dangerous thing. Alex, he's just learning." I tried to ask what he meant, but he shut the door before I could get a word in. Weeks passed. The notes escalated from phrases to drawings. Strange symbols, lines, and shapes that made no sense. Once, I found a tiny key taped to my doorframe. No lock, no explanation. The fear was constant, gnawing at my mind. I avoided leaving my apartment at night. Even during the day, I felt watched. Then, one evening, Clara and I were closing the bookstore when we saw Alex sitting on the steps outside, sketching something in a notebook. He looked up, smiled faintly, and waved at me. My stomach churned. I couldn't look away. That night, I found all the sketches from the week taped inside my apartment. Symbols, eyes, stairways, and a figure that looked exactly like me, standing in my bedroom doorway. I left Ashford the next morning. I didn't pack much, just essentials. I called a cab, left the key on the counter, and didn't look back. I thought distance would solve it. It didn't. Months later, I got a postcard. No stamp, no return address. Just a single line, written in tiny, precise letters. "I've been watching." Still learning. I haven't returned to Ashford. I don't know if I ever will. I don't know what Alex was planning or why he did it. But sometimes, when the wind rattles a fire escape, or I hear a faint scratching at a window, I think of that small Vermont town and I feel him watching again. Story 6. The Apartment Above the Lake. 2 years ago, I moved to Lakewood, a quiet town in northern Vermont, to take a seasonal teaching position at a small local academy. I'd always wanted a change of scenery from my hometown in Connecticut, where life felt stifling and predictable. The academy was small, and the town even smaller, just a few streets hugging the lake, surrounded by dense forest. I rented a modest apartment above a lakefront cafe, drawn to the view more than anything else. The building was old, a 3-story structure dating back to the 1920s. My unit was on the 2nd floor, with large windows overlooking the lake. I had neighbors on both sides, an elderly couple who kept to themselves, and a young woman who worked at the cafe below. Most evenings, I'd sit by the window with a book, listening to the faint splash of the water and the occasional boat motor in the distance. At first, life was serene. I spent my mornings preparing lessons, my afternoons walking along the shoreline, and my evenings reading or sketching the reflections of the sunset on the lake. But one night, something shifted. It started subtly, a faint creak above me, almost imperceptible at first, like someone shifting their weight on the floorboards. I dismissed it as the old building settling, but then I noticed it more frequently, always around midnight. Steps pacing back and forth, whispers too low to discern, and the soft sound of furniture being dragged. I lived alone, and the woman above, Mrs. Keller, was supposed to be away for a week visiting her sister. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was all in my head. But I began noticing other things. Small objects slightly moved, the faint smell of lavender, Mrs. Keller's signature scent, drifting into my apartment, and the faint sound of a door clicking upstairs. One evening, I went out for groceries. On my return, I saw a shadow at the top floor window, standing still and watching me as I unlocked my door. My heart raced, but when I looked closer, no one was there. A week passed. I confided in Daniel, a colleague who lived nearby and often came over to drink coffee and chat. He suggested I leave a note for Mrs. Keller, in case she'd forgotten something, or her neighborly visits had unintentionally scared me. I wrote it, slipped it under her door, and went to bed. That night, I woke to the unmistakable sound of footsteps descending the stairs from above. The door to my apartment shook gently, as if someone had tried to turn the handle. My first instinct was to run, but my phone was charging on the counter, and I didn't want to leave it behind. I crept to the door, peeking through the peephole, but the hallway was empty. I returned to bed, heart pounding, when I heard a soft knock at my bedroom window. My blinds were drawn, yet the shadows of someone's fingers brushing the glass were visible. I froze. The knock came again, 3 quick, deliberate taps, then silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. The following morning, Daniel came over, concerned about the coffee table in my apartment. It had been moved closer to the window, exactly how it had been before, yet I had left it untouched. He suggested calling the building manager, but she was notoriously difficult and dismissive. I decided to investigate myself. I took the small metal key for the service door leading to the roof and carefully climbed up. The rooftop was empty, the wind rustling the tar paper beneath my feet. The door leading to Mrs. Keller's apartment was closed, but there were faint scuff marks on the paint, as if someone had been trying to push it open from the outside. I returned to my apartment shaken, but tried to maintain normalcy. That evening, I decided to smoke on the balcony to calm myself. I noticed the small wooden gate leading to the stairwell. It was ajar. The strings I tied to keep it shut had been severed. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I slammed it shut and replaced the strings, my hands trembling. A few nights later, Daniel stayed over. He usually slept soundly, unaffected by noises, but that night he awoke to whispers and the soft sound of shoes tapping against my balcony floor. He nudged me awake, and we both listened as the wooden gate creaked open and shut repeatedly. Then came the voice, a language neither of us recognized, a low, guttural whisper that sent chills down my spine. We waited in silence, breath held until the footsteps stopped. I called the local authorities, who arrived within 15 minutes. They searched the building, but found no one. No signs of forced entry, no one hiding, just the cut strings on the gate and a faint scent of lavender lingering in the hallway. The officer gave me a polite nod, shook his head, and left. "Old buildings play tricks on your mind," he said. For weeks, I lived in terror. Every creak, every whisper, every shadow made my heart race. I began sleeping with the lights on and curtains drawn. I left small cameras in the apartment, but reviewing the footage revealed nothing. No intruders, no shadows, no explanation. Just my own reflection in the glass, staring back at me with wide, fearful eyes. Eventually, Mrs. Keller returned. She claimed she had been at her sister's and the whole week had been uneventful. I tried to speak to her about the noises, the footsteps, the moving furniture, but she dismissed me with a polite, tight-lipped smile. "Maybe it's just the building," she said. "Old wood, lots of wind, you'll get used to it." I moved out a month later, unable to shake the unease. Yet, even now when I pass Lakewood on the highway, I think of that apartment above the cafe, the gentle creak of the floorboards, and the soft whispers that seemed almost alive. I never discovered what or who was really there.